Michèle has had a nearly 30-year career in the United Nations. She's worked directly for 3 Secretary Generals in senior policy advising and sort of policy planning roles, with responsibility for strategic thinking on emerging challenges, the geopolitical landscape, and the future of international cooperation. So most recently, she was the director of the Summit for the Future, which we're going to hear more about today. She conceived and led the effort to negotiate the historic Pact for the Future, which is the most comprehensive global agreement in decades. There are copies here for you to read or take home. Actually, Michèle does not want to take these back. So these will be staying here. And a really storied career earlier on that I won't sort of belabor for you. On a personal note, I'm really excited to have Michèle here because we were classmates in the London School of Economics in the
a long time ago.
A long time ago. You can do the math. She's worked for 30 years, almost 30 years at the UN, and we met before then. So you were all very exceptionally smart students at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So anyway, I'm really excited to welcome Michèle, and welcome to MIT.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming on this very frigid day. And thank you, Taylor, in particular, for making this possible. I saw the lineup of speakers you have for this Wednesday series for the rest of the semester, and all I can say is I'm very glad I get to go first, because those would be some very hard acts to follow. But also, actually, I'm delighted that you'll get real experts on some of the issues that I'm going to just touch on superficially, who can kind of tell you really what's going on in the world, because there's some great speakers lined up. I'm here in my personal capacity. Some of the views and kind of editorial comments I'll make are really my own, but I am also going to kind of walk you through this Summit of the Future effort, which I've been involved in for the last 5 years, and which culminated in September 2024 with the agreement that I just waved at you, called the Pact for the Future. Some of you may have heard of it, some not. And I'll walk you through kind of why it matters, how we got there, and also you know, kind of what it tells us about the future of multilateralism. As you can see, I'm really bad at slides because I didn't mean to actually strike through the word future there. And please don't read anything into that. But in a nutshell, the summit itself took place in September 2024, 4 days, 2 involving all the kind of heads of state from all around the world who came to New York and adopted this big agreement that I'm going to talk about, and then 2 what we call action days, where civil society, young people, people from all over the world, the largest gathering actually of civil society we've ever had at the UN, also came and you know, gave their ideas, and all of this stuff is online. There's lots of stuff webcast if you want to go back and see more. But it was a pretty great kind of couple of days. It was also, I think, and the Pact similarly, I think we could regard as a bit of a high watermark in international cooperation, given what's likely to come over the next couple of years, given the kind of state of the world right now. And so something I think that it's important to know about and care about if you do care about international cooperation, which I'm pretty sure most of you in this room do. So anyway, as I said, I'm just going to talk a little bit about why the Pact matters, what's in it, how we got to it, and then, you know, a little more about kind of what I think it means, what it tells us about the future of multilateralism. The Pact covers issues on which we've not had agreement ever, and issues on which it hasn't been possible to agree in decades. But it fell short of some of our goals, to be honest, you know, and I'll kind of talk a little bit more about that. And I think part of that is because of what's happening in the world right now. And the fact that, as I said, multilateralism really is at a crossroads. Global power is being redistributed, risks are rising, opportunities are also proliferating, but maybe not equally available to all. So, you know, the summit and the negotiation process towards the summit really showed all of that at play. I sadly couldn't bring copies of the Pact for everybody, so I just brought a few, which I was thinking would maybe just kind of stay here for people to look at. But it's all online for those who want to take a look at it, and I'll get to kind of more specifically what's in it and why in a second. But let me just tell you a little bit about why we even did this and how we kind of got there. So this whole process started in 2020, which most of us obviously remember as being the kind of start of COVID. It was also the 75th anniversary of the UN. And so we were already in the Secretary General's office thinking about the fact that it was really important to use that anniversary to kind of confront member states, but also people around the world, with the ways in which international cooperation was falling short of what we all need it to deliver. 75 years since World War II, the generation that experienced a world war is mostly gone. A lot of people, especially in advanced economies, maybe don't feel the need for international cooperation, certainly not in their own lives. And there's less and less leadership around the world making a good case for why such cooperation matters. We didn't want this to be a big discussion on UN reform or even on the UN per se. What we were really hoping for was a look at not the institutions of international cooperation, but really the ideals, the idea, the goals that we all share, the need for it, and then to take a look at the system we've got and ask ourselves to what extent it's falling short, to what extent it's delivering but not being perceived as delivering, to what extent we need to actually develop new norms, new institutions for ungoverned areas, new areas of human activity, and whether that's domains where war is being fought in new ways, or new opportunities for development. So we really kind of felt that we were at a moment where that conversation was necessary. It was also clear to us at the time that we weren't delivering on some very, very existential issues. The Sustainable Development Goals, which were agreed in 2015, are really not on track. A lot of countries are actually, kind of going in the wrong direction on some of those major goals. Climate change is clearly, kind of ahead of where the international kind of consensus is. Our efforts through the Paris Agreement are not enough to kind of curb global emissions, to keep climate change in check. And all of that was happening as COVID then kind of happened. And we thought COVID would be something, would be a moment that would also kind of waken people up to the need for international cooperation. A time when even in advanced economies, people understood on a visceral level that without the WHO operating, without scientists cooperating, without the supply chains working, without aviation working, without all of the science and everything that was needed, vaccines weren't going to be getting into their arms. And that somebody having COVID in a faraway country was still something that might matter in their lives. And so we felt that we were at a moment when people might actually be receptive to a message about the importance of international cooperation in a way that they haven't been for a very long time. I think we all know that that's not actually how COVID played out, unfortunately. There was turning inward, there was vaccine hoarding, there was not the kind of solidarity and cooperation that we truly believed was important. So when the member states of the UN adopted a resolution marking the 75th anniversary of the UN 75 Declaration, in that resolution, they gave the Secretary General an opportunity to give them big recommendations on both the present of international cooperation and also the future. And boy, did we seize that opportunity. And that's this report here called Our Common Agenda, which you can find online. And in that report, which is written, by the way, in a much more kind of frank, jargon-free, plain language way than a Secretary General usually writes a report. And there was a reason for that. We really wanted this report to appeal to people all around the world, not just to be read by foreign ministries and heads of state and government, but by ordinary people. And we wanted the message to get through to people. And what the report said, and we continue to believe this to this day, is, first of all, we're at a moment of real existential, certainly potentially catastrophic risk in the world. The risks are getting more consequential, more complex, harder to tackle. International cooperation is not evolving in pace and in keeping with the kind of level of risk we face. People are losing trust and faith in institutions at all levels, local, national, and international. and that is in and of itself eroding the kind of most essential ingredient for international cooperation, which isn't whether or not we have a UN, it's whether or not we trust each other and are willing to work together. So it was a very strong message, essentially saying business as usual. Don't kid yourselves. It doesn't mean things will stay the same as they have. It means that things will get materially worse. And I think that everything that has happened in the world since that report came out in 2021 pretty much confirms that message, and that we need to get really serious about the kind of norms and structures through which we cooperate at the global level if we are going to keep pace with the kinds of risks that we now face, but also if we're going to harness the new opportunities we face in the world with digital and technological advances, and make sure that those opportunities are made available not just to the few but to the many. Because, by the way, a world this unequal, in which all of those advantages and breakthroughs are available and benefiting only a fraction of humanity, is by definition a much more unstable world. And I think, again, that's probably something people in this room understand on a deeper level even than I do. So one of the things we suggested in this report, we suggested a lot of things. One paragraph in the report, however, was to say we should have a summit of the future in a couple of years, and at that summit we should really address all of the ways in which international cooperation is not delivering. And that includes both not delivering on our existing goals, whether that's the Paris Agreement on climate or the Sustainable Development Goals or all of our disarmament and non-proliferation goals, but also all of the new areas that have emerged of human activity, whether that's the fact that we now have 92 countries operating in outer space, and our last treaty on behavior in outer space was reached when there were 2 countries up there, or all of the new developments in AI and technology that are essentially ungoverned at the global level. And so our suggestion was essentially, let's have a summit where we look at all of these issues and really kind of come to grips with and begin to change how the international system manages these things, how we work together. Member states were not all universally enthused about this idea. And I'll come back to this in a second, but there's a lot of member states who felt any effort to look over the horizon at the future was by definition going to be at the expense of efforts to deal with current problems. And so that was particularly a reaction on the part of a lot of developing countries who felt like, oh no, shiny new toy, we're going to forget about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and we're going to talk only about new things, new technology, stuff that global north and rich countries care about, but the stuff that means very little to people in my country. So we had a long process of kind of trying to persuade member states that no, we actually can walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to be able to talk about the present and the future at the same time. And frankly, actually, if we look at some of these ways in which the world has changed and we tackle them and we look at them through the lens of sustainability and fairness and everybody getting an equal shot and everybody having an equal voice, actually that will deliver better the Sustainable Development Goals and some of the things that you most care about. I tell you that because having proposed the summit, we then actually had a kind of a 2-year-long process of negotiating the summit outcome, the pact, which I'll get to in a minute. And that's longer than we had hoped. We initially hoped to have the summit in 2023 for a lot of reasons. One of which was that there was already a summit planned in 2023 on sustainable development. And our idea was that the Summit of the Future would essentially be the kind of complementary summit that would look more 10, 20, 30 years into the future. In the end, member states said, no, thank you. We'll do our summit in 2023 on sustainable development. And we'll have big fights with each other on, you know, who's funding what, who's keeping their promises, what our priorities are. But then we'd like to do the Summit of the Future in 2024, and we'll have all those fights all over again, but we'll also have all of these new fights. I mean, I shouldn't say fights, discussions. Felt like fights at some points. So the decision was to have the Summit of the Future in 2024. Now that had a couple of consequences that I can go into a little more in the Q&A, but I mean, one obviously was that it happened not long before the election in this country. 2024 was also a year in which many, many major countries had elections. So you know, a year of political flux that we had kind of slightly been hoping to avoid. But actually, in some ways, one that kind of created different conditions for the summit that were, you know, equally possibly conducive to a good outcome. But what it also meant was that we had a 2-year period where we were negotiating this pact when the real world essentially was changing underneath our feet. So the goalposts kept shifting as we were engaging in these negotiations. And just a couple of examples. February 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. Massive, obviously, shift in everything, certainly at the UN. Every conversation at the UN changed that day in certain dimensions. October 2023, we have the developments in Israel and Gaza. Again, massive, massive shift. And by the way, those two conflicts have been obviously and continue to be foremost in the minds in all negotiations at the UN, and the different ways in which different countries have engaged with those two conflicts, and the feelings that there are certain standards being applied in one place but maybe in the other, really were a kind of a pervasive kind of undertone in the negotiations. 2024 was the hottest year on record. So climate concerns were obviously rising and rising and rising over the course of our negotiations. And then finally, obviously, we had massive developments in AI. In fact, it's kind of funny if you read the Common Agenda report, we talked about these things, but I think we would have talked about them much more had that report come out a few years later. So clearly a world that was where the risks were getting worse, more consequential, more obvious to people, no matter where they live in the world. The opportunities were also obvious, but not available to most. And I think important to understand that when we are doing a big negotiation at the UN like that, we are very attuned to the real world, and it's intruding on the negotiations at all times. So we did, however, manage to agree on this pact, and it has a lot in it. And hopefully a lot that's of interest to a lot of you. The way it's structured is not how I'm going to present the issues, because the very structure and scope of the pact in itself was actually somewhat of a negotiated compromise, which is very normal at the UN. But just so that you know, it has kind of a main pact with 5 main chapters: development, peace and security, science, technology and innovation, young people, and then kind of fixes to global governance. And then it has 2 annexes, one on global digital cooperation and one a declaration on the needs and rights of future generations. But I want to actually package some of the kind of major elements of it slightly differently, because as you can see, for instance, our chapter 3 on technology overlaps with it doesn't overlap, but I mean, the digital and technology stuff I'd rather tell you about all in one go. So just very quickly, what did the pact deliver? And the reason I want to walk you through some of this stuff, I mean, I know eyes glaze over sometimes at, what happens at the UN and at some of these international agreements. But the truth is, first of all, and I don't think it's just because I gave 5 years of my life to this effort, what's in, although it might be part, it took 20 years off my life, by the way. But these agreements, like every head of state in the world and government in the world has signed up to this agreement. And it was a hard fought brawl in the negotiating room. But it only matters if people actually know what's in it and then hold their governments to account to live up to their commitments, right? And that is not just true of this pact. It's true of every international agreement. And the UN, for all its flaws, is still the place where 193 countries come together and agree with each other. And they can still agree, and they do still agree, including on really, really big issues and in spite of all of their differences. So I regard it as my one-woman mission in the world to make sure that everybody kind of cares about that and understands that, and then does what they can in their own lives to make sure that their governments understand you don't just get to go to New York and sign a big agreement and then leave and act as if you didn't sign that agreement, right? And I think that is especially important these days. So the first set of issues in the pact were all around digital cooperation, technology, all of the kind of major breakthroughs and developments that are happening in science, in medicine, et cetera, et cetera. And there were kind of 2 big sets of goals there. Obviously, managing the risks more effectively, including managing issues around human control of AI and lethal autonomous weapons and stuff like that, but also sharing the benefits more fairly. And as I said, there was a huge through thread in this whole negotiation around the fact that a lot of countries feel very left behind by global developments, and also left behind by our current structures of international cooperation. Big countries with huge numbers of people who don't feel adequately heard, don't, for instance, maybe have a seat on the Security Council, but also smaller countries who truly depend on the UN for their security because it's the only place where they have any say. So all of the package of outcomes on digital technologies were really about both managing the risks and kind of sharing the benefits. And some of the, there were a lot of things around closing digital divides, enhancing digital literacy, finally connecting the 2.6 billion people who aren't even online yet. Governments made commitments, for instance, to connect all schools, hospitals, and people to the internet by 2030. I don't know if we're going to succeed with that, but we have a better chance of success if people know that they committed to that, right? And then there were also a lot of commitments around safety online, making the internet a safe place for children, for women, human rights online, data governance. And then there were several sets of kind of agreements and decisions on AI. Now, this was really the first global agreement on the governance of AI. There hadn't been one before. And one of the kind of interesting things that will be set up as a result of the pact will be a kind of a scientific panel on AI, a little bit like the panel, the IPCC that we have on climate change, which hopefully you've all heard of, which issues, very science-based reports periodically on the impact of climate change that, kind of as a way to ensure that the evidence is available to decision makers. There were also a lot of commitments around retaining human kind of oversight and control, especially of kind of technologies that could be used in warfare. A second set of outcomes was on peace and security. Obviously, there's a lot of long-standing issues of peace and security that we haven't solved yet. And there's a lot of ways in which war looks, you look at Gaza, you look at parts of Ukraine, you look at Sudan, and war looks very like it has looked for decades. But there are also a lot of new domains in which war, conflict, and competition are playing out, some of which we don't see, some of which are undergoverned, some of which people don't want you to see. So we tried in this negotiation to both, kind of encourage, and we succeeded for member states to really recommit to the kind of long-standing norms and guardrails that we have to govern war and peace, international law, the UN Charter, all of the principles around sovereignty, territorial integrity, international humanitarian law. But we also included a lot around how to govern and manage all of these new domains and new kind of tools of conflict, and how to avoid weaponizing them, how to make sure that we kind of understand their implications. So whether that's lethal autonomous weapons or the proliferation of satellites and satellite access and internet access, and we all saw, for instance, with Starlink in Ukraine, the impact that could have on a battlefield, whether it's the cheap availability of drones, the new vulnerability with undersea cables and undersea, all of the kind of critical infrastructure stuff. So there's a whole load in the pact about all of that stuff. There's also language on nuclear disarmament, which I know matters to some people here. Now, you might read that language and think, okay, well, this is not all very new, but actually getting the nuclear powers to recommit to some of the things that they have committed to in the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation space at a time like this was a serious achievement and nearly killed us. So nuclear powers, for instance, agreed to a world free of nuclear weapons without any conditions or caveats. That was a very, very difficult thing to get them to agree to. It almost derailed the pact in the end. And again, I say this not because I think this is going to change the world overnight. We all know what's happening with nuclear arsenals in certain places that are getting modernized and expanded, contrary to what international agreements commit to. But the fact that they recommitted in September 2024 really matters, and people need to know that, and they need to remind their governments of that, and they did do that. Another major kind of issue that was agreed in this pact that we haven't had agreement on since 1963 was Security Council reform. Again, it's not going to happen overnight. Nobody's happy with how the Security Council is functioning right now, but the permanent 5 members of the council actually agreed to expanding the council to giving Africa, if not a permanent seat, some kind of much more representation that is much more fair. They agreed to limits on the veto. They agreed to moving towards negotiations on concrete expansion and concrete changes. Again, some of these things, your eyes might glaze over. You might feel like, this really isn't ever going to actually happen. And, is it really going to matter? But I think it'll only matter if people, again, remind their governments that they've signed up to this. Some of these agreements were beyond anything any of us could have imagined. And the fact of having a summit on the calendar and the fact that everybody's heads of state were going to be coming to New York was what created the pressure that led to that agreement. Another set of agreements, and as I mentioned, I think, there was a lot in the negotiations, and there's a lot in the Pact on Sustainable Development and Financing for Development and climate financing. If I'm honest, these were the most pivotal issues in the negotiations. And I think it's one of the privileges of working at the UN and kind of seeing every country every day show up and tell you what they care about, which is understanding how many countries and representing, billions of people for whom these are really the most important issues: poverty and hunger and things that we, I think, in this room are largely lucky enough not to experience in our daily lives, but that for those countries matter incredibly. So one of the again, you can see I screwed up this slide. Sorry. One of the kind of most important things, I think, in the whole Pact, and again, if you were to just read it, I don't think this would come across, but it's a set of agreements on international financial architecture reform. I mean, I think we need to be aware that for all of the developments we're talking about in war and peace and technology, we're also living in a world where there's massive economic stagnation, where debt servicing actually, 3 billion, more than 3 billion people live in countries where debts, spending on debt outweighs any spending on health and education. Countries are being left further and further behind. And that, as I said earlier, is a massively destabilizing thing that I think, we all need to pay much more attention to. And it was a major through thread in the negotiations. So there were agreements on financing, like immediate financing for the SDGs, immediate financing for climate. One of the big fights was on, developing countries really want to make sure that climate financing is additional to development financing, because there's a lot of kind of double counting where countries will say, this is ODA, oh, but by the way, it's also climate finance. And so there were countries kind of really holding the line on, no, like, you have to keep you've made promises on both and you have to keep the promises on both and don't try to double dip. Obviously, a lot of the kind of richer countries got pushed further than they wanted to on that. Some of the other things on financial architecture reform that I think are really worth pointing out, there was a lot in the negotiations around how unfair the current system is in terms of power and representation. That was true on the Security Council. It's also true in the World Bank and the IMF. The Secretary General likes to say we can't solve the problems of our grandchildren with systems built by our grandparents. The truth is that both the World Bank and the IMF, but also the UN, in terms of the structures and how power is allocated, and the Security Council is a good example, but voting shares in the IMF and the World Bank are another example, really reflect the world of 1945, 46, 47, and not the world of 2024, 2025. So there are some very major countries in the global south that feel very strongly, and it's hard to argue with them, that they should have much more representation in some of these bodies. There's also more generally a feeling in developing countries that they are not effectively served by or heard in some of these bodies. So there was a set of decisions around improving representation of developing countries in the IMF and the World Bank, improving access for developing countries to what's called concessional financing, which basically means kind of low market rate loans for poorer countries. Addressing the debt crisis, which is truly, truly a major global issue. Improving the kind of financial safety net for countries. So for instance, the next time that there's a COVID or something else, that there would be more, one of the big things that happened in COVID was that rich countries were able to inject much more money into their own economies to keep businesses afloat, to keep people in their homes, to pay workers even who couldn't go to work. Poor countries were not able to do any of that. So how COVID got experienced economically was just massively different if whether you were a rich country or a poor country. So some of what's in the pact was designed to address that. There's a whole set of things, and again, this is one chapter in the main pact, and then it's also this declaration on future generations around what we call intergenerational solidarity. You know, in the Common Agenda report, we talked about the fact that there's trust has broken down at all levels, right? It's broken down within countries, between people and their own governments, their own institutions. It's clearly broken down between countries. And it's really broken down between generations. Young people do not trust us old folks to do things right, to govern for them, to take them into account. And they want more of a voice in decisions that affect them. Future generations aren't even born yet, but we are doing them active harm every single day. And we can't pretend that we don't know. So climate change is obviously the biggest example of that, but it's not the only example of that. So the pact committed to both at the national level, you know, because each member state is signing this thing, but also at the global level, much more opportunities for young people to participate in decisions that affect them. And in the Declaration of Future Generations, putting in place some practical steps, including appointing an envoy and having a kind of a global forum on taking account of future generations. So, you know, no longer making decisions every day that we just know are going to harm those who will come after us, and not caring and not holding ourselves to account for all of that. And then finally, there's a whole set of decisions on what's called transforming global governance. Some of them are those I've already touched on: Security Council reform, international financial architecture reform. Others include, you know, revitalizing the GA, looking at whether we could have a better setup for dealing with massive global shocks. You know, like COVID, which, you know, we kind of had to make it up as we went along with COVID. So are there ways for the Secretary General to convene all the key actors really quickly in a way where people are then obliged to actually do what they say? Because with COVID, that didn't go so well. In the face of a massive multi-sectoral global shock, such as another pandemic, but it could also be a massive cyber attack, or, you know, there are many, many kinds of shocks that it could be. And actually our main point there was, we need to get away from an international system. And by the way, this is mirrored in national systems that's very siloed. Because one of the problems with COVID actually was it was a health crisis, and the kind of health machinery was trying to deal with it. But within 5 minutes, it was a socioeconomic disaster, a human rights disaster, disaster for women who were trapped in situations of abuse. It was a tourism disaster, you know, and so it was multi-sectoral in its impacts. But there wasn't one piece of the global architecture that could really pull all of that together and have that conversation across. We had the same thing with Ukraine, actually. And we were able to apply some of the lessons in Ukraine that we had learned with COVID. Very, very quickly, the Ukraine crisis went from just being a war in Europe to being a food and fuel and fertilizer crisis around the world, right? Its impacts were felt all around the world. And in that case, the Secretary General was able to pull together something that he called the Black Sea Grain Initiative, where he had the shipping industry, the insurance industry, the key countries, you know, all sorts of actors that he pulled together in order to essentially find ways to alleviate the impacts on poor people, especially of the fuel, food and fertilizer prices and supply impacts of Ukraine. So the idea with in the pact was that we should be able to do that in the future, and we maybe need some kind of protocols and agreements on what that should look like. And finally, there was, and there's also, for instance, an agreement on peaceful uses of outer space. As I said, the last treaty on outer space was reached in 1967 when there were 2 countries that were up there. We now have 92 able to be up there, and more coming, with very few rules governing how to manage debris, how to manage space traffic, how to make sure exploration of space is sustainable, but also fair, so that, again, poor countries don't just get left behind. So there's a whole set of agreements on that. And then finally, there's an agreement, and this was something where we fell short of what we had initially wanted. One of the things we tried to say in the Common Agenda report was, look, international cooperation isn't just governments anymore. Governments obviously are the ones who make decisions. They are still the ones who set the, you know, regulation landscape. They are the ones who are members of the UN who sign these agreements. But, you know, whether it's COVID and big pharma with the vaccines, or whether it's the fossil fuel industry with climate change, you know, there is not a single really major global issue that doesn't also involve other actors. And in particular, for instance, the private sector. I mean, when you look at social media, the big technology companies, you know, people call some of them the new superpowers. a form of international cooperation that doesn't see and understand and try to hold those actors to account is one that is by definition falling short. That was a conversation that not all member states were equally enthusiastic about. There are a lot of countries who hear us say we need to involve the private sector more, and they think, okay, you're creating more opportunities for me to be heard in the Security Council. Maybe I'll get a seat. But meanwhile, you're opening the back door to companies, all of whom are based in the West. None of those companies are based in my country. So there's a very legitimate fairness kind of issue to that push for what we call more multi-stakeholder input into global governance and multilateralism. But it's also true that certain regimes are more or less comfortable with the idea of if not private sector, maybe civil society having more of a voice. So, there are some countries who are very, very keen to hold a line and say the UN is an intergovernmental organization. And it's true, it is. And by the way, I think we should want it to be, because guess what? We really need governments to do their jobs. So and we were not suggesting that the UN not be an intergovernmental organization where governments make the decisions. And I think COVID was also a reminder of the fact on a national level, you need governments, everybody, we all need governments to do their job and do it well. But we need to find a way to make sure that, big, powerful actors who are not governments, hopefully can sign up to agreements, if not formally, then informally. And that's what our action days, for instance, was about. So that the big technology companies can say, I agree to be bound by the Paris Agreement. I agree to be bound by the SDGs. I care about a fairer, more sustainable world. Even if I'm not a government, I'm going to do what I can. So we try to make sure to kind of create spaces for companies to kind of sign up and feel accountable for all of these global goals, so that we, really kind of shift the needle. So there was a lot of that in there as well. I'm looking at my time, and I don't want to take too much. Oh, look, another screw up. Sorry, I like my little. And by the way, it's kind of funny where the strike throughs are. They were supposed to be underlines. Anyway, this is why.
You were focusing on this.
Also rushing. So let me just kind of I want to kind of in this last few minutes talk a little bit about what all of this tells us about the future of international cooperation, what I feel I learned at least, and this very much is just kind of my view at this point. But I think, certainly, clearly there's been a decline in trust, as I said, trust in each other, trust in institutions, trust in multilateralism, support for multilateralism. And one of the ways in which this showed up for us, and this is where I show my age, the last time we did a summit of this scope, which was in 2005, there was definitely a group of countries that were just unquestionably supportive of the UN and of multilateralism, no question. And we knew that they would support a Secretary General who was trying to, push a difficult conversation out into the world and get member states to really think about the state of multilateralism. This time around, I have to say that's not really true anymore. Support for multilateralism is not a given anywhere anymore. There's a much more transactional approach to international cooperation, even in countries that used to be much more all in. You don't see a lot of leaders, I think, who make this one of their major planks. There's no votes in it. And I think that we all understand why that is. It's kind of always been the case. But as I said earlier, we are now many generations from a time when people experienced a world war and came out of that world war and said, oh my God, we need international law. We need international cooperation. They matter for all of us, no matter how rich we are. So, for us as the UN, operating in an environment in which all those old assumptions seem to be gone, it's very difficult, and it's something on which I do hope the pendulum swings back eventually. But that was the reality of this process, was that the number of countries willing to just say, no country liked everything in this pact. I mean, of course, they weren't supposed to. It was it covered every issue, right? The value of a pact like this is that you get countries to agree more in a big negotiation like this than they would in a dedicated negotiation on nuclear, for instance, or on Security Council reform. And that's exactly what happened. We got more than we expected on many, many issues because they were trading off across issues, right? But of course, that also means that they're giving some things and not liking some things. So it was very politically difficult in that sense, but I think it also showed its value. I think the North-South divide, the divide between, the kind of the rich countries, the North-South is maybe more of a UN kind of way of talking about this, but the developing countries versus the richer countries was a very deep through thread, and I mentioned it, whether it's on issues of financing or on being left behind by technological breakthroughs. And I think we can continue to expect until we find a way to introduce more fairness and sustainability in everything we do, that will continue to be an issue and an impediment to international cooperation. The big powers, and by the way, there are more than just two of them, and it depends, of course, on the issue. But whether it's the size of your army or the size of your economy or the kinds of weapons you have or the strategic dominance you have in a particular field, the way of understanding who's a big or the size of your population. There are a lot of powers out there now who really have the ability to shape and lead beyond their own region. And unfortunately, they definitely have a tendency to see a lot of these issues through a kind of a zero-sum lens. It's a very competitive, very fraught moment in geopolitics. They have the same approach to their alliances and relationships. And I think one of the other things that this negotiation really showed was the extent and the kind of developments that happened while we were negotiating, the extent to which countries, are using multilateral forums as places to kind of build alliances, not just for themselves, but against others. And that also was a kind of a through thread in the negotiations. And I think it's a trend we can expect to continue. We are, people often say, we're heading towards multipolarity. We are firmly in multipolarity. We live in a multipolar world, no question. There are many, many more countries who are involved in other countries beyond their regions than was the case 10, 20, 30 years ago. Many more countries who can block things they don't like. Fewer countries who are willing to really show global leadership. And I think that's also a kind of a very difficult time to try to pull off a negotiation like this. And it showed in the negotiations. But, there are other ways in which countries assess their interests, and there are other alliances out there. And I think one of the things I would say is, while some of these major fault lines and major, ways of organizing, the North-South, for instance, the negotiations, countries assess their interests and assess their alliances through different lenses, right? If you're a climate-affected Caribbean country, then that is your major existential priority, and you make common cause with other climate-affected countries. And the bloc of climate-affected countries actually is a very, very, I won't say they're powerful in any of the kind of traditional metrics of power, but they're a very powerful moral voice in the UN because people really recognize that they are facing an existential risk. So countries do organize in different ways depending on the issue. And that was also another interesting and complex thing about this negotiation is, depending on the issue, we had very different countries working with each other on very different things. So, the formal negotiating blocs in the UN, the G77, which is the kind of 134-member developing country bloc, but it also includes China and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, countries that aren't economically developing anymore, but they negotiate together. But the minute you start talking about climate, some of those countries end up on very different sides of the discussion, right? Because some of them are fossil fuel economies, some of them are climate-affected countries. So we definitely had, very different alliances and fault lines playing out in different negotiations. And again, that was something we were able to make work for us to reach this pact. It's why doing a big summit kind of can make sense, even though, to be honest, when we started this process, a lot of people said, oh my God, are you kidding? Like, why are you doing this? But it's a very complex landscape, and understanding and navigating it is something that definitely melted my head quite a number of times. I think the issues around technology also, you have countries that already feel that they have a strategic advantage in those areas. They do not want to do anything that might kind of affect that strategic advantage. Certainly not necessarily anything that might advantage the competitors they see in that space. But the reality is that the vast majority of countries simply want to catch up, and they want a chance, and they want access to the same things that everybody, that, you know, that they see everybody else having. So again, the fault lines start to be different. I think the impact of major security threats, you know, I mean, Europe is extremely focused on what's happening in Ukraine, obviously. I think for a lot of African countries, you know, especially once we were able to deal with the food and fuel and fertilizer issues, that felt like less of a global priority and more of a regional priority. And, you know, you can definitely see very different standards and very different levels of attention being given to what's happening in Sudan compared to what's happening in Ukraine or the Middle East, for instance. That feels really horrible for countries who care a lot about what's happening in Sudan, for Sudan's neighbors, and certainly for Sudan, for the people of Sudan. So, you know, that sense of double standards, of selective application of rules, of you know, powerful countries caring more about international law over here than over there, of actually contradicting themselves in this theater versus that theater. All of that also pervaded the negotiations in a very complex way. But it again, it created interesting alliances at some points, you know, in terms of kind of what outcomes we were able to get. So, you know, I can see my time ticking. And just a couple of kind of closing reflections from me after this 5-year Sisyphean task. We still do have more that unites us than divides us. That's not just a cliche, it's actually true. And countries still actually understand that. They can still agree with each other, including on big issues like technology and nuclear and international law. And the pact is evidence of that. And I think it's important that we all have a bit of a at least equally glass half full sense of multilateralism as glass half empty. And the reason I say that is because so much of international cooperation is, as I said at the beginning, about trust, and it's about perception. If we think that we can do something and we can agree with each other, then turns out we can. If we think it's useless and we don't invest in it and we don't, you know, press our governments to take it seriously and to behave responsibly in international fora, then, you know, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think it's you know, I'm not just saying this because I've given my 30 years of my life to this and it pays my bills, but it really matters. It really matters that we believe in international cooperation, and international cooperation is still possible, including on some of the hardest issues. And the old blocks and the old fault lines aren't the whole story. There are lots of other ways that countries are thinking about alliances, thinking about the issues, forming alliances across regions, across income levels, across geographies. And those matter because we can make those kinds of trends work for the greater good if we're smart about it. But, you know, I mean, the truth is, I think countries do want very different things from the international system. You know, I mean, I'm not going to start naming names, but if you're a very big power that has a lot of power, you know, a kind of in the existing system, if you have a permanent seat on the Security Council, if you already have nuclear weapons, if you already have a majority of votes in the World Bank and the IMF, you may not be that keen on change. And I think the status quo powers certainly didn't love a lot of what we were proposing here, because a lot of it was basically saying to them, you need to move over and make space for others. You know, we can't have 1945 power realities in 2025. So, you know, those countries want the system to stay more or less the same. Other countries want it to change. Some countries want the system to deliver them sustainable development or to deliver them more meaningful and serious climate action. Other countries want the system to leave them alone. They don't really see that they're benefiting much from it, and they just don't want it to be interfered with. So, you know, countries do want very different things from, and I'm saying the system as opposed to the UN very deliberately, because this is about the whole global governance architecture, not just about the UN, not even just about the kind of old institutions that were set up in the 1940s, but also the newer ones, the BRICS. You know, there are lots of kind of newer alliances and institutions. Some have kind of actually acquired institutional permanence. Others are you know, more like a regular meeting. But it is a system, and I think different countries are engaging with it in very different ways. As I said earlier, more of them can block things they don't like than in the past. But very few are willing and able to kind of play a global leadership role, because that's really, really difficult to do. And the Secretary General would attest to that. It also took years off his life to try to play this leadership role on this pact. So, I mean, I think bottom line, we will, for some time to come, continue to face that paradox whereby international cooperation is more existentially important than it's ever been. You know, I mean, military expenditure is higher than it's been since World War II. Risk of nuclear war is higher, perhaps, than ever. Climate change, obviously, risk is higher than ever. I mean, the kind of risks we face are truly, truly huge. So, you know, we need international cooperation more than we ever have, but it is harder to achieve. And I think the fact that this summit process took 5 years, you know, and the fact that like we got an outcome, great, but it definitely fell short of some of what we wanted is also testament to that. So I think the big question I have that I would leave you with as well is, how do we really start to shift the calculus? Like, how do we make international cooperation sexy again? How do we make it something that leaders actually want to go out and pitch for? And I think the answer is people, right? Because you know, politicians are cynical. They'll do what they think will get them the votes or the attention or the clicks. And until people start really caring about and showing that they care about international cooperation and that they understand how much it matters in their lives, I'm not sure how much things are going to change. I mean, the alternative, of course, unfortunately, is that, you know, it will take a crisis bigger than COVID. I really hope that's not the case. We really thought COVID was quite big enough of a crisis, thank you very much, to remind people why multilateralism matters. That turned out to be maybe half the case, but not entirely the case. So, you know, I would like to hope we don't need to go through something else like that before everybody wakes up and says, oh my God, we actually do need to really kind of invest in this system of cooperation we have. We need to believe in it. And we need to use it, and we need to abide by the agreements we've already made. We need to evolve and adapt where it is out of date, but we need to stop constantly trashing it and pretending it doesn't work at all, because that actually, as I said, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I will stop there. Thank you for your attention. Speaking for an hour is hard.